Derek, pull that mic in there a little bit if you can, and good afternoon to you. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
Good. So we're talking Jimi Hendrix. We'll have that on in the background just a little bit. It's not exactly background music, is it, Jimi Hendrix?
Jimi Hendrix plays Bob Dylan. I mean, can't be bad.
So that's All Along the Watchtower. Is that his biggest hit, would you say?
I'm not sure if it was the biggest. Purple Haze was quite a big one, and
Little Wing.
Yeah.
So 1942 sees the arrival in Seattle, Washington of Jimi Hendrix.
That's right. And by the time he'd reach his teens, his father bought him his first acoustic guitar. And then shortly after, he bought an electric guitar.
Yeah.
And in his teens, he was in a couple of local groups, the Velvetones and the Rocking Kings. And then he went off and joined the Army. In fact, he joined the 101st Airborne Division, which was the Band of Brothers division, parachute regiment.
So the music he would have been playing would have been very different to this music we're listening to now, I should imagine.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is 66, 67, 68, 69, when the music changed completely.
Yeah.
I mean, when he came out, he actually, the official story is that he broke his ankle and got sort of invalided out of the Air Force. But I did read that perhaps he left by mutual consent.
Oh, interesting. So he's only in there a year, was he?
No.
He's in there longer than that?
No, he was in about a year. Yeah. He wasn't in there all that long. But when he came out, while he was in there, he met a guy called Billy Cox, bassist, and they formed the King Casuals. Yeah. And then when he came out, he was with a bunch of touring bands. I mean, big people. He was working with Jackie Wilson, Little Richard, Sam Cooke, and he was the backing guitarist on tour. And during this sort of period, he was called Jimmy James at this particular time, or Jimi Hendrix rather. Jimi Hendrix with a double M-Y.
So was he born Jimi Hendrix?
Was he?
Was he born with that name, Jimi Hendrix?
He was, but it was spelled double M-Y traditionally.
Yeah.
What happened was that he met a guy called Curtis Knight, and Curtis Knight invited him to become the lead guitarist of the Squires. Now, Curtis Knight introduced him to his manager, a guy called Ed Chaplin, and that will come back to haunt him. Yeah. He never really did much in the way of recording in his own right at this particular time. He did some recordings with Curtis Knight. I mean, he did recordings with Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, all kinds of people. But when we get to about 1966, in fact, famously on July the 5th, 1966, Chas Chandler, who'd been the bass player with the Animals, a British R&B group, their career was coming to an end, and they finished off with an American tour. And he decided that rather than find another band who needed a bassist, he'd go into management. Wow. And Keith Richards' girlfriend, Linda Keith, had seen Hendrix perform quite a lot, and she persuaded Chas Chandler to go along to the Café War, one of these famous sort of coffee bar type gigs at the time, and he saw Hendrix performing then as Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, and Randy California was in that band as well. And he got the name California because there were two Randys in the band. Right.
So one from California.
One from California, one from some other state that I can't remember the name of. Anyway, Chas Chandler then, a couple of months later, flew Jimi Hendrix over to London. I mean, despite having had a very active 2 or 3 years playing with some major American people, he was completely unknown. But shortly, a week or so after he arrived in London, he famously jammed on stage at Central London Poly with Eric Clapton. Yeah. And they played Killing Floor.
Two great guitarists.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But apparently Clapton was a bit put out at the skill and showmanship of Jimi Hendrix. Yeah. And rumour has it he almost abandoned the guitar. Wow. Unfortunately, neither of them did. But then they pulled together the Jimi Hendrix Experience. They brought in Noel Redding, a bassist, and Mitch Mitchell, a drummer. Mitch Mitchell actually failed an audition for The Who sometime earlier, so that would have been a very different band without Keith Moon. And they set off to France. They played their first actual gig together as The Experience in France on a short tour. I think it's about 5 gigs with Johnny Halliday, the French superstar, basically, rock and roll superstar of the time. And then towards the end of 66, they came back and released Hey Joe, their first single. And that's one of these interesting ones that gets talked about as being traditional.
Hey Joe?
Hey Joe,
I'll look it up while you're talking, yeah.
And if you actually see the original labels, or the singles with the original singles, you'll see the label has the writing credit of traditional arranged Jimi Hendrix.
Oh, wow.
Well, I'm not sure if you knew at the time, but a guy called Billy Robertson actually copyrighted it in 1962. The Leaves recorded in 65, but Jimi Hendrix was very influenced by the Tim Rose version of Hey Joe, the 66 version.
Shall we have a quick listen to it?
Oh, absolutely.
Here we go. Just a little bit of it, shall we say?
Yeah.
Well, we've had a couple of emails in. Jeff from Torrevieja says, nice show, Dave, thanks. Please play Voodoo Child. It's my favourite Jimi Hendrix track that's on in the background at the moment. And we're talking to Derek Shelmerdine here about Jimi Hendrix. And so that's for you, Jeff. Unfortunately, we haven't got the time to play all these tracks. That one's 5 minutes 13, for instance. Also, one of those artists, this is from Daniel in Calahonda, says one of those artists where it's sad he went so young because he had so much more to give. I think his performance at Woodstock is one of the best performances ever. Really love the song Little Wing. When you try to play the song yourself, you realise the genius of the man, as it's incredibly difficult. Let's go right back to 1967. Why does he set fire to his guitar? What's going on there?
Well, it just seemed like a good idea at the time. He'd always been flamboyant. And even back in the days when he was playing with Little Richard, he used to play the guitar behind his head. And apparently Little Richard let him go because he was taking too much of the attention off Little Richard himself. But he famously set fire to his guitar for the first time when he did a UK tour supporting the Walker Brothers with Cat Stevens and unbelievably Engelbert Humperdinck.
What a mixture, Jimi Hendrix and Engelbert Humperdinck.
On the same bill, can you imagine? But this is now 1967. This is the summer of love, so really anything goes. But that particular guitar he set fire to that night sold in 2008 for £280,000.
Wow.
Imagine how much you'd got it if it hadn't been damaged.
Probably not so much.
Probably.
And so moving on to 1967, released Are You Experienced?
That's right, his first album. Absolutely superb. I remember buying that at the time, and I was in a band at the time, drummer Cleo's Mood, and jumping on the bus, taking around the bass player, said, you must listen to this. You must listen to this. It was amazing. But really, his big break in America came around this time. This is now the summer of 67. He performed at Monterey, which is not technically the first pop concert, pop festival, but certainly the first really big successful.
I wasn't expecting to be with the Monkees here.
Yeah, well, what happened was that Mickey Dolenz and a couple of the other Monkees were actually in the audience, and they saw Hendrix play, and they invited him to open for them.
Wow.
But the problem was that the audience, the Monkees audience, was typically sort of 9 to 11-year-old little girls. And Jimi Hendrix, we'd just been listening to, it wasn't really the kind of thing. But the urban myth that got put around was that a group called the Daughters of the American Revolution actually petitioned the promoters and got Jimi Hendrix slung off the tour, but that's absolutely not correct. What happened was Jimi Hendrix was getting a little bit bored with playing his first set through chants of, we want the Monkees, we want the Monkees, we want the Monkees. And he just told the Monkees that, this has been a lot of fun, thanks very much, lads. And they split very amicably. But there was an Australian journalist, writer with the tour, Lillian Roxon, and she was the one who said that she created the story about the Daughters of the American Revolution, and that's gone into sort of urban myth as the great reason why he left the tour. But shortly, about a year later, in 68, he released his third album, Electric Ladyland. And now Chas Chandler was starting to get a little bit bored of the perfectionism, I think, and the stuff with Hendrix. And he decided that he'd rather move on. And Noel Redding also left. He formed his own band, Fat Mattress. And in fact, when Hendrix did his American tour around this time, he played as the support act for the Hendrix tour. So he's playing bass in the Hendrix set, starting off as vocalist and guitarist in the Fat Mattress, his own band, and then he'd switch the 4 strings for the Experience gig.
Wow.
So,
unbelievable.
It was good fun.
So he finds himself with Lulu on Lulu's TV show. Again, another mixture of different genres there, I suppose.
Oh, very famously. Lulu had her own TV show, and Jimi Hendrix was on due to play Hey Joe. And he started. This clip is widely easy to find on the up on the internet. It's well worth looking at. And what happens is he starts off with this amazing version of "Hey Joe," and then they just stop. And Hendrix says words to the effect of, "Enough of this rubbish. We're going to play a tribute to the Cream." No, I don't think he actually said anything out of order. It was going out live, of course. But he did say, "Enough of this rubbish." And then we'll play some. And they went into a stonking version of "Sunshine of Your Love." And he said, as a tribute, wherever you are now, because Cream had just split up. Whatever you are now, this is for you three guys.
Wow.
And it is a stonking version. And if you're halfway like Hendrix, it is well worth doing a quick check to find that TV clip. It is absolutely awesome.
Let's move on to Woodstock. We just mentioned that there because of time. I'm just moving on a little bit here. Great. Somebody's already emailed in, Daniel from Calahonda, I think it was, saying that Woodstock was the best performance ever in his mind.
Oh, it is a stonking performance, that particular one. He performed there as the Gypsy Sun and Rainbows. He was back now with Billy Cox, the bassist he'd met up with the King Casuals back in his Army days, and now Billy Cox really is with him through to the end of his career. But I mean, Woodstock was an absolutely amazing performance.
Isn't it quite interesting, just about trying to kind of put people into kind of pigeonholes here, but was it unusual for an Afro-American to be playing this kind of not heavy rock music, but this kind of progressive rock music, or would you class it more as R&B or rock, or is it difficult to put him into a genre?
Well, he almost created. I mean, genres were being created. I mean, you could argue that this is very much the birth of rock, and he's there along with people like Cream, who were changing the face of music. But there were a lot of musicians around at that sort of time. This music's all based in R&B and blues, and when you get to 66, 67, then you had this whole new genre of heavyweight producers and guitarists and bands who just took rock music to the next level. Because rock and roll itself had been and gone.
By this time.
By this time.
Let's move on now. Just skipping a little bit here, because he opened his last US tour in 1970, and then in August of that year performed at the Isle of Wight. Again, you don't think of the Isle of Wight and Jimi Hendrix together, but that, of course, was a great festival, wasn't it?
I was there.
Yeah, were you?
I saw him there. Yeah. I remember thinking at the time that a little bit more subdued than I was expecting. But Joan Baez followed him, and she came on stage, and she just said, "How can you follow Jimmy?" And it was. I mean, it was a stonking performance. But I mean, at that particular 3 days, you had the Doors, still with Jim Morrison, the Who, still with Keith Moon.
So that was a great festival.
It was. I mean, 10 years after, a whole load of superb.
How would you know at that time that just a month away that... Let's just basically touch on 16th of September, he's jamming with Eric Burdon and War at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club, of course, and 2 days later he's gone.
That's right. I mean, the Isle of Wight was his last performance in the actual gig in the UK. He went off to Germany and he did some concerts there, came back, and he was a big friend with Eric Burdon. And Eric Burdon was now with War, and they were doing it. They had a gig at the Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London, and Jimi Hendrix just got up and did 2 or 3 numbers with him. I think that the set was the early hours of the morning, so that's why it looks as if there's a sort of day or 2 days between, but there really wasn't. He sort of came home, of course, didn't get up till the following afternoon, and then went out, and then with his girlfriend, Monica Danneman, they went back to, I think it was her apartment, and he went off to bed, and when she went to wake him up, she couldn't rouse him, and he was covered in vomit. And that's what the death certificate actually
he choked
says.
On his...
He choked on his own vomit. But chatting earlier, there are people who don't quite believe this story. There was a guy, I can't remember his name, it might have been one of Jimi Hendrix's roadies. He wrote a book, and in it he claims that Jimi Hendrix was actually murdered
Wow.
So it's good to think there's a degree of mystery associated.
It always
with
seems to be with these sort of things, yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time as far as any more Jimi Hendrix music is concerned today. But thanks for coming in, Derek.
My
as always,
pleasure.
if anybody wants to find you, mention your book, Rock and Roll Unravelled, as well.
Yeah, absolutely all of this information is in the book Rock and Roll Unravelled. And if you check out the website, rockandrollunravelled.com, there's lots of information there as well. I'm very active on Twitter, RNR Unravelled, and Facebook, Rock and Roll Unravelled.
Who shall we do next time then? What do you reckon? You got any ideas?
We can give some great thought to that. I mean, it is the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Summer of Love.
Yeah.
And there's so much interesting stuff going on there.
Let's go to San Francisco. Right, okay. Thank you very much, Derek. And as always, I think you're on the Skype next time. We'll be chatting to you because you're back in the UK. Thank you, Derek. Cheers.